Hey my glam girls, welcome back to my channel. It's Chelsea, where we talk about all things glam and all things girly. I'm a beauty consultant who loves to talk about everything dealing with beauty and makeup, and today we are talking about Lisa Eldridge's new eyeshadow palette. So I picked up two, and so we have the shade or palette in Myth right here. And then I also picked up Sorcery because as soon as I saw Sorcery, I was like, if I only get one, this is the one that I'm going to get. So I'm gonna be sharing with you how I created both of these eye looks, of course, my thoughts on the formulation, and if I feel you should have it. And then I do have a couple of comparisons at the end of this video, so stay tuned for all of that. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I truly do appreciate it. And let's get right into this video. So Lisa came out with 5 new eyeshadow palettes, and they do retail for $68. Unfortunately, the palette that is sold out is the shade or the palette Sorcery. I think everybody was thinking the same thing, like this is a color story that you really don't see all too often. So she also came out with, I wanna say 5 new lipsticks, and there's a lipstick that complements this palette Sorcery that is also sold out. One of you all asked me if I could find a dupe in my collection, and I think I have found one that is somewhat similar, so I'll share that one at the, or toward the end of the video. But getting into these eyeshadow palettes first. So first starting off with Sorcery, she says that this is inspired by medieval tales and legends. Sorcery is a story of magicians, fairs, and fantasy of the Middle Ages. So she says, be spellbound by this precious curation of multifaceted jewel tones that have all of the drama of a peacock's tail, perfect for bold evening looks, which I totally agree. And this palette is going to be cruelty-free, and it's also free of microplastics and talc. So Lisa also says that although each is already filled with its own unique color story, her eyeshadow palettes are totally customizable. You can mix and match your own bespoke palette of shades. And so if you look at the back of the palette, you'll see these 3 dots here and then 3 dots here. I'm hoping you can see them. So you can stick a pin through it, poke out these shades, and if you want to combine shades from another palette of hers with, you know, shades in another palette, you can do that, which I think is great. And then she says that you can shop individual eyeshadow refills on her website as well. So awesome, I did not realize this. So you can actually go in and buy the individual shades in any of her palettes, and the individual shades are $16 US dollars. I love this. This is so neat. So if you wanted Sorcery, and this palette is out of stock, but there was a particular shade you wanted from Sorcery, then you can see if those shades are in stock. How neat, Lisa! I am here for this. Okay, so getting into this eye look here, I definitely wanted to go dramatic, and so when she said that in her description, I was like, this is not a palette that we're gonna do subtle looks with. I mean, you could do a somewhat subtle look with this, depending on what brush you go in with and, you know, the tones that you put together. But for the most part, this one is bold and beautiful, and I love it. So I first started off with this shade called, I think it's pronounced Troubadour. She calls this a seamless matte shade, and the description of the shade is a deep inky teal, which is beautiful. So I wanted to create a very nice, like detailed, I guess you could call it a wing structure. So I started off with this shade first, and I will admit I didn't know where this eye look was going, and you'll kind of notice that as I'm going through the tutorial. And so I love that it was so easy to get the pigmentation that I wanted. So the pigmentation that you see in this pan is the exact same pigmentation that you're going to see on the eye. But what I do also like about this is that depending on the tool that you use, you can customize the intensity of it. So for instance, when I initially was drawing and carving out that V on my eye, you saw the most pigmentation because I was using a very small, dense brush. But then as we go on into the tutorial, I go to add more of that shape, but I'm using a flat shader brush that is not as dense as the liner brush that I was using. And you can see that we get a little less intensity from that color, but you can still build it up. So loving this seamless matte shade. Also, the formula did not produce any fallout for me. And it reminds me of Natasha Denona's Creamy Matte formula, but so far with me using this shade, there is no patchiness or anything like that. I think this one is beautiful. So after I went in with that teal shade, I went in with this shade here called Swan Song. This is a metallic shade, and she describes it as a rich sapphire blue. And oh, sapphire is my birthstone, so I love all shades like this. It is stunning. So I took this shade and basically traced around the teal shade, and I also brought that along the lower lash line as well. And before I forget, I took Troubadour and I applied it very tight along the lower lash line and kept it toward the outer edge of the eye. This shade had also great intensity. I don't believe I experienced any fallout from this shade, even though it was a metallic shade, because the formula is very smooth. So even with me going in with a liner brush that could have produced fallout, I didn't get any fallout, and I was really impressed with this shade. So after that, I wanted to go in with this shade here called Mercurial. And this is a luminous shade right here. This is a luminous shade. And she describes this as a prismatic green to heather duochrome. This shade, look at the shift. Look at her. She is so intense and pretty. And I love the duo shift of like the green and golds. I'm hoping you all can see it. It is stunning. So I took that and carved out the rest of my crease area and just brought it into the sapphire blue shade as well. And so by this point of the eye look, I was like, I think I want to do a little more. So then after that, I think I wanted to go back in with Troubadour. I can't remember if I went in with Troubadour next, or if you're seeing me go in with Mage, which, let me just describe Mage in case I am going with it. So this is Mage right here, and it is a metallic shade. It's a pale silvery sage green gray with icy blue, pink, gold, and green pearls. All the shades all in one. And it's so crazy because looking at it up close, you can definitely see every shade that she described in the shadow. So if I went in with Sage, I put Sage along the middle of the eyelid, and then with Troubadour, I wanted to add more depth to this outer area. So I went in with a flat shader brush, and I then started to just blend it into Sage. I think I went in with Sage first and then Troubadour as I'm remembering it. You've already seen it, so just, you know, don't pay me no mind. So I started to blend that into Sage, and I really liked the transition of having that seamless matte shade with this metallic shade. Once again with Sage, even though it is a metallic shade, it's just like this sapphire blue shade called Swan Song. It was very smooth in its formulation. I didn't get any fallout. And I loved how I was able to build up that shade too. If I wanted to have it more intense, I could have gone in with my finger, or I could have wet my brush. But I like to use shadows without manipulating them when I'm first showing them to you all, so you all can see what you're working with. If you just want to put them on your eyes. I did prime my eyelids with the Lancome Prime It and Boost It primer, but that was all that was on my eyes before I went in with the shadows. Okay, and then after Sage, I went in with this shade, which I believe is going to be my most favorite shade in this palette, called Mercurial. And Mercurial is described as a prismatic green to heather duochrome shade. I just realized that I called this shade Mercurial, and it's not. This shade is called Madrigal. Wasn't that the family's name on Encanto? I should know because we watch Encanto literally every day. It is Riley's favorite movie, and so we watch it all the time. But Madrigal is a blackened antique green gold shade. So this is the shade that I use to line or create this line right here. So forgive me for saying this the wrong shade name and wrong description. Okay, but Mercurial is right here. This shade, do y'all see the shifts of the greens? Oh, this is my favorite shade in the palette. It is so beautiful. It is a little less opaque in its base, but obviously it has base because you can see it, and it doesn't look like what I like to call fairy dust on the eyes. It's not that opaque less. So I do like that this shade could be worn alone on the eyes by itself, or you could use it to put on top of another shade to intensify it, add a little bit more of a pop. Like, this shade is beautiful. And so I took Mercurial and I added it to the inner corner of the eye and also the inner corner of the lower lash line. And then I also went in with Madrigal and I put it right along here. And I went in with Mercurial and added it right along here. Honey, I'm feeling this eye look. Like, no, this is not one that we would wear all the time, but this is definitely a palette that I would use for like holiday looks, like if I just want to be over the top, because there's nothing wrong with that either. Like, this eye look is giving, and I love it. I love it. Every formula in this palette was just stunning. And let's just talk about this packaging. Like, Lisa Eldridge did not disappoint. There's a really beautiful, nice size mirror in this palette. I was able to comfortably use the mirror while I was creating my eye looks. And I love it. I really, really love everything about this palette. Sorcery, most definitely surefire winner for me. Then we move on to Myth. So with Myth, this is what Myth looks like. And Lisa says, adorn your eyes in rich synergy of decadent color from lavender gray and smoked amethyst to pure violet. Myth palette takes its inspiration from the Mauve Decade and Victorian Gothic hues. Wear these shades alone, washed across the lids for a wearable, beautiful clouds of color, or dial up with the darker hues for a dramatic eye look. So I first went in with the shade called Mauve Decade. And Mauve Decade is described as a velvet shade, and it is a muted gray lavender. Most definitely will agree that this is a different formulation. So looking at it, I was like, okay, it reminds me of the Seamless Matte shade in the Sorcery palette, that teal green shade, but the formulation is different. This also reminds me of Natasha's Creamy Matte formula, but I think this shade, this velvet formula, might be closer to her Creamy Matte formula versus Troubadour, that teal shade. So I took this shade and I used that to blend out this shade across my transition area of the eye. And then after that, I went in with this shade called Victorian Trim. Victorian Trim is also a velvet shade, and it's described as a rich and brown, vibrant mulberry. So I took this shade and I began to apply it across the middle of my eye, but then I was like, wait, I want to put this all in my crease. So then you see me kind of going into my crease with this shade and blending it out toward the outer edge area of my eye. So then after that, I went in with this shade called Violet Stone. Violet Stone is also a velvet shade, and it is described as a pure violet shade. So went in with that shade across the outer area of the eye. I took this shade also on the lower lash line just a little bit. And then I wanted to go in with this shade here called Nocturama. And Nocturama is described as another velvet shade, and it's a deep blackened violet. And so I love this shade because looking at it in the pan, I was like, is this like a cooler toned black shade? But then when I applied it on the lower lash line, I was like, no, this has got like a deep plum hue to it. I love this shade. It is beautiful, beautiful. So then after that, I went in with this shade right here called Faded Amethyst. This is a metallic shade, and it's a smoky and lustrous taupey amethyst. This shade, I could most definitely see me using it all across the lid for like a quick one and done look. It's so beautiful. Like if you took Deep Mauve Decade and then this shade called Faded Amethyst and put them together, how cute would that be? So cute. And then after that, I went in with this shade right here called Illusionism. She describes this as a top coat shade, and it's a transparent base with ultraviolet sparkly pearls. Would totally agree that it is a top coat type of shade, but the shade can hold its own because you can see it right here in the inner corner, and it doesn't look like there's no base to it at all. There's a base to it, but it's not so intense that it can't be put over another shade. I also took this shade and applied it for the brow bone highlight and also the inner corner of the lower lash line. And guys, this is also really beautiful. Now I will say this palette, in terms of like color story, I'm pretty sure I have shades like this. If I were to look through, you know, every palette that I have, I do have shades like this, but the formula is stunning. And like I said, even though this reminds me of Natasha's Creamy Matte formula, every shade is beautiful. No shades were patchy. Every shade blended really beautiful. And with this velvet formula, you do and you can build up the intensity. So when you first apply it to the eyes, I noticed it a lot with these, you know, deeper shades. You don't get a ton of intensity right off the back. However, they are buildable. And I love that as I'm building, I don't see any patchiness. I don't see any dryness of the formula. And it's stunning. I didn't have any fallout with the velvet shades, and I don't think I had any fallout with these two shades either. Like, I'm looking at my eyes, trying to remember if I had fallout, and I don't remember having any fallout. So this formula, like, yes, you might have tones like this already in your collection, but the formula is where this palette really wins and stands out, because when I first looked at it, I just assumed by looking at it that the velvet shades in this palette were similar to this seamless matte shade, but it is not. I would say that the seamless matte shade is going to be more intense in color right off the back. And like I said, with the velvet shades, those shades are going to be a little more buildable, which it's nothing wrong with them at all, because it's not like you don't get intensity at all. But if you want these shades to show on your eyes like they do in the pan, you'll just have to build up the shades, which I'm totally fine with when I know that I'm gonna get the intensity that I want. Lisa, you did an amazing job on these palettes. I'm so happy that I picked them up, and now I'm kind of like, do I need all of them? Do I need all of them? Because I feel like I do, because I was looking at the other palettes and I was like, well, I feel like I have shades like this. Like, there's a palette called Cinnabar and Vega and Muse, and I was like, I have these shades over and over and over again. So that's why I didn't get them. I wanted to try palettes that I was like, I don't have these shades as much. But the formula is making me want all of them, because the formula in these palettes, I don't think you have in any and all of your palettes. I think that's, like I said, that's where these palettes win. Okay guys, so I am kind of blown away. I could not find a palette in my collection that actually looked like Myth. When I say look like Myth, I could not find one palette where I was like, yes, this could, you know, somewhat be sort of kind of similar. I don't have one. Now, you know, do I have like multiple shades that has like a couple of these? Yes, but one palette by itself, I don't have it. And y'all know this is a color story, if you know me. This is a color story that I love. So that actually makes me really happy that I could not find a palette that I already had that had this type of color story. Now with Sorcery, I did find a couple that I was just kind of like, that could work. That could work. So the first one that I thought about was the Metropolis mini palette by Natasha, and I was more so looking and I guess thinking of like this green shade right here, which made me think of this green shade right here. And obviously they are definitely not the same type of green, but I did think about that. But then I went into the actual larger Metropolis palette and I was like, okay, I could see us drawing inspiration from the Metropolis palette to maybe create some similar looks. So obviously the shades are not identical, but if you have the larger Metropolis palette, I feel like you could get similar looks that are going to have some of these tones in this Sorcery palette. Like I said, not gonna be identical at all, but maybe you could get some similar looks. But in all honesty, I really do feel like the shades that Lisa picked for these two palettes, and especially the formulation, I don't think you're just gonna be able to like, oop, I found this exact palette dupe in my collection. Now, I could be wrong. I could be wrong. And if I am wrong, please leave it down in the comment section below, especially if you do have a palette that's very similar to Sorcery, because I know that one's out of stock and people would like some type of maybe dupe or something like that if they don't wanna wait for it to come back in stock. So if I am wrong, leave it in the comment section. I'm completely fine with admitting that. But at least in my collection, I don't have anything similar to it. Now with the shade Sorcery in her lipsticks, I found the shade by Pat McGrath called Guinevere that I think is quite similar. And I'm gonna insert a picture of the shade Sorcery. Here is Guinevere from Pat McGrath. So this is one of her matte shades or one of the matte formulas. And this looks sort of similar. I feel like Lisa Eldridge's shade is a little more muted. It's a little cooler, just slightly. This shade, Guinevere, I feel is going to be more warm, but I think it gives us a similar feel as Sorcery does. This was the only shade I could find in my collection that I felt came close enough, because all of the other shades that I thought could work were just either too light or light. They were just completely like not even in the same family. So I hope that this helps, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts down below, what you think of the eye looks I created and the palettes. Did you pick them up? And if you did, do you like them? Let me know all of that down below. And if you've made it to this point in the video and you have yet to subscribe to my channel, I would love for you to consider subscribing and joining the Glam Girl Squad. And guys, that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope to see you in my very next video. Bye guys.